this edition of Careers That Matter, I'm joined by Roger Pielke Jr., who is a professor at the University of Colorado, and he's a well-noted commentator on scientific matters and in particular climate. Roger, thanks for joining me. You have been a professor, but you're about to transition out of that. Why don't you give us a sense of what your career and your career aspirations are moving forward?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I've been a professor for more than 20 years. And the best part of being a professor is get to work with students and see them move on. And I've been doing this long enough. I get to see my students succeed and go into influential positions. But the other part of being an academic is I get to write and I work with ideas and I get to interact with policymakers. I do policy research. And I think for my next phase of my career, I'm affiliating with a think tank, the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. And in the U.S., there's several notable big think tanks, but they're a lot closer to the pulse of government and policy than an academic is. And so I'm going to try to take a lot of the work I've done, my colleagues have done, and bring it more forcefully into the policy process, and hopefully open up some space for some broader discussions and participate in that crazy, messy world of policy and politics.
So what will that look like on a day-to-day basis for you? How are you going to have influence, and what's the sort of work that you have to do to ensure that you do have that influence?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what I do won't change day to day. I'm a researcher. I write peer-reviewed papers. I have a popular Substack where I get to engage the public and broader audiences. Being affiliated with a leading think tank in Washington also means I get to participate in events and talk face-to-face with real-world policymakers. And so I think it's not so much the character of what I'll do is different, but the context in which I do it will be dramatically changed. Obviously, policymaking involves a lot more than just ideas and proposals from eggheads like me. It involves trust, give and take. We're at a moment, not just in the United States, but many places around the world where there's deep partisan splits in government. And so figuring out ways to identify policies that may be less contentious or can fly under the radar is some of the important work that think tanks generally do.
To wind up in a position like that, though, you have to have a level of credibility. Aristotle, when he laid out the three pillars of rhetoric, said you have to have, credibility, logic, and emotion. Tell us about your career. How did you develop the kind of credibility that you now have so that you can, take on a role like this with think tanks and be, an author of note that people want to follow? Where'd you get started, and what was the path that you took?
Yeah, so my father is a famous atmospheric scientist. He helped to develop the science of meteorology and weather forecasting and worked in climate impacts. And so, I very much growing up, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Always thought I'd be an academic of some sort. Along the way, I had a transformational experience. I got to go to Washington, D.C. and work as a staffer for the House Science Committee. So the Science Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives. I was just a junior, lowly fellow, but I got to see important scientists interacting with policymakers. And I realized at that time, they sometimes didn't communicate very well. The scientists would come in and they would, they want more money for their research. The policymakers would say, well, the scientists don't understand the political realities. The scientists would say, well, those policymakers don't understand the facts. And I realized, well, okay, this is interesting. This is a place where, it's one of the most amazing things about democracies. We need experts to run society. But at the same time, in democracies, we think that anyone can be elected. And I think we've proven that many times. Anyone can be elected and everyone can vote. So it's a challenge how to reconcile democracies and expertise. And so for me, realizing early on that, number one, people have vastly different views. In the US, we have Republicans and Democrats, and sometimes they're at each other's throats. But policy requires that not everybody think the same things, but people agree to act together. So figuring out how to do that, for me, it's a fascinating puzzle that involves the technical. So policy has a lot of technical elements, but also the political. And along the way, experts need public support, credibility, and trust if all this is going to work. And I think we saw in COVID, it's very easy to destroy trust in the short term if we experts don't do our jobs and policymakers don't respect the process as well.
So you go to Washington and you go through that experience. Where did that lead you to in the next step of your career?
So the next step of my career was I decided to do research on policy issues that matter. So I wrote a PhD dissertation on how climate science can be useful for climate policy. And very quickly, I realized, it's not the science agencies that are the most important. It's the Department of Agriculture. It's land management. It's public health. It's people who are actually out there doing things that have consequences. So I have, over the years, have been fortunate in that I've worked on issues like hurricane impacts, flooding impacts. I spent some time working on issues of sports governance, and I look at eligibility requirements for transgender athletes. And I recently did a project looking at COVID-19 and science advice around the world. And for me, the reason to take these projects on is because the research matters to people who are making real world decisions that affect real people. We don't always get it right in the research community, but it's essential that we listen to the public and to policymakers as we think about what projects to take on, so that we have a better chance that our research is useful and makes a difference as people are struggling to make better decisions.
So as you moved into that phase of your career, were you now within academia at the University of Colorado, or did that come later?
Yeah, I started out after I got my PhD at the U.S. National Center for Atmospheric Research. It's in Boulder, Colorado. It's a large, federally funded research center that does research on all aspects of the atmosphere. What they say is from the center of the Earth to the center of the sun. And the projects I worked on were how to make weather forecasting more relevant and useful. In Canada and the U.S., Europe, weather forecasts are really good. And they've continued to improve. But a lot of the action in getting value from weather forecasting is how people use them and how people avoid misusing them. So fortunately, I was able to interact with a lot of people in insurance, in reinsurance. We did a project with the state of New York on roadway salt, for example. And so I had an opportunity to sit in a place where a lot of people were working on projects for practical outcomes. This was, there's some curiosity-driven research everywhere, but a lot of it was focused on, well, how do we get the stakeholders and the people out in the real world? So I was at NCAR for 8 years, and then decided I wanted to interact more with students. So I had an opportunity to start a science policy center at the University of Colorado Boulder, where we tried to operationalize all these ideas across a number of fields. And it's, for me, being in academia has been enormously rewarding.
So along the way, of course, because of your interest in science and explaining it and helping policymakers understand what the science means, you can't help but be drawn into the I guess, North American and Northern European discussion about where we're going with human-induced activity that affects climate. That proved to be challenging at times for you, and yet you kept going. What was it that motivated you to keep moving forward?
Yeah, there's a few things here. One is in the North American system of higher education, we have this crazy idea of academic freedom, and this idea that that we professors can follow our ideas and thinking wherever it may lead, and we're not going to get fired for expressing an idea. And in the U.S. we have tenure, and so I've taken those ideas seriously. I have tenure and academic freedom for a reason, and so I'm going to use it. One thing I realized very early on in my career, that if you put ideas out there in the world, some people will like them, some people won't. If you put policy proposals out there, if they happen to be implemented, there will be winners and there will be losers. And so doing policy research is inherently a political act, and it has political consequences. So for example, in 2015, a member of the US Congress decided he didn't like my recent congressional testimony. So he decided to ask my university to investigate me. Well, for no reason. And I will, be honest, it was not a fun time. It was not great professionally. It was a very difficult time. But at the same time, I came through it. And I think, in the span of time going through that experience, number one, made me more adept at dealing with these situations, but it also gave me some credibility. That you stick to your guns on these issues, even if you're politically attacked, and ideas aren't they're not going to kill anybody. So you just put your ideas out there, and they become part of the process. And if you're lucky, people take them seriously. So for me, it's been a long journey of learning how to be a public intellectual in difficult spaces, but I do think that we need people to take on those roles. It's not for everybody, but asking difficult questions and making powerful people uncomfortable, that's okay. That's what we do in democracies.
One of the goals of this series is that young people who are at the early stages of their own career development, as they're trying to decide what to do, might look at you and go, well, I want to be like you. But for every career, for every person, there's something in you that opened you up to possibilities, put you in right places. What would you say are the 2 or 3 top personality traits that you possess that allowed you to be able to create and, for the most part, enjoy the career that you've built for yourself?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I would encourage this for any young person, no matter what field they go into, but learn how to express yourself, whether you're speaking or writing or doing math, or maybe it's art or in the humanities. Learn how to express yourself well. I have noticed over my career that college students that I encounter have become less adept at writing, and writing is really important because if you want to reach a large number of people, you can talk to them, but you can only talk to a certain number of people, even if you get a big audience. But if you write a piece and you get it published in a national newspaper, for example, or you have a very prominent position on the internet, or today, if you're on TikTok, you can reach a lot of people. And the better you're able to express yourself, the more likely it is you'll get your ideas across. The other thing is patience and persistence. None of this happens fast. I got to do what I'm doing after 25 or 30 years of hard work. And if you want to have influence in policy settings, you can team up with organizations that share your values. There are a lot of great advocacy groups there. But what I just talked to a group of college students the other day, and I told them, well, when you do that, you're not going to be the boss, and you'll be carrying forward someone else's ideas. If you want to be that person, then set that long-term goal and step by step move in that direction. And the other thing is being out there and having impact with writing or ideas isn't for everyone. There's a lot of positions out there in policy and politics where people are in fact behind the scenes, and they are helping an elected official or an agency head or a corporate CEO to do their own job better. And so there's a lot of opportunities for people to have outsized impact and still be invisible and not be in the public eye. So there's a lot of important positions out there that depend on the sort of skills of expression and thinking and ideas.
Well, I applaud you for the work that you've done, and I'm sure that you would say that you feel like you're making a positive contribution to the world in which we live. Thank you very much for giving us a glimpse into your world and how you got to where you are.
Thanks for having me.